Hello and welcome to the J Plus R Movie Podcast. On this week's episode, we're going to be discussing, in sort of a continuation of our animation double feature, Persepolis, the French-Iranian co-production that basically follows the story of Marjan, this Iranian girl who grows up in like the 70s and then 80s within the really turbulent period of Iran's history, going through like revolutions and wars, and then follows her life as she like grows up into a woman as she moves away from the country. When she then comes back to Iran, about her experiences, what she deals with emotionally, her family situation. It's all done through animation, specifically black and white traditional animation, and that's what's used to like tell both the realistic parts of the story and also the surrealist ones.
I thought it was a really, really good film. I found it really, really effective. I like the black and white animation style. It makes it quite stark, almost lends a feeling of authenticity to it, especially because a lot of the black and white it kicks in for the past. I mean, most of the film's in black and white, but it's usually depicting past events, so it almost gives it almost a documentary-like feel, despite how subjective it is, which is really interesting in terms of the way it's evoked. I liked the way that the animation kind of had almost a childish perspective. Marjan is very much rooted in the perspective that she developed in her childhood, so it makes sense that she would see it that way. And putting a journey of self-development against the self-development of a country and the way that it is now was really fascinating, and it made for some character growth and environmental shifts, especially as she follows it from a very different perspective. When those discussions come up about social issues and the way that she just almost doesn't take them seriously is quite interesting, as well as the darker aspects like the suicidal behaviours and things like that.
Yeah, I really liked it too. I just found it to be really insightful and also a very interesting portrayal of very hard life that this person has lived, but trying to also find things to learn from it and also trying to tie all of these events together to show again some sort of growth from childhood to adulthood. Because the thing that's noteworthy about this movie is that it's almost 100% based on reality. Mark John was actually like the co-director of this movie, and it's based on a series of like comic books that were basically recounting her life in almost the exact same art style as this film.
They were literally biographical comic books that it was based off of. I don't know about you, but I watched the original French language version as opposed to the dub.
And that's a bit interesting because in the dub, it is really well voice acted. But there is a little bit of a clash because people are speaking with like different accents. Whereas in French, it's pretty much just all French. So that problem isn't really applicable in the French version. But I think regardless of it, you still get the Iranian aspect of it because it is so heavily focused on Iran's history.
In some ways, that's an advantage the English dub could have had. It was because she's a character that ends up in such a cultural diaspora. If they'd actually gotten all Iranian actors, or at least ones who could do a proper Iranian accent for the scene set in Iran, and had the different dubbings when they're abroad, then that would have worked. I don't think they did that in the dub. Well, in the French, at least everyone's consistent, so you get that. Forces the focus on character as opposed to realism. The whole point is that it's a subjective retelling of a real event. So while it is real, it's the reality as it seemed to a child who grew up in it.
Unless it's Marjan being told about something that's happened, I don't think there's any proper scene that she's not in. For the most part, it is entirely from her POV.
Those moments are from her POV. They don't include her in it. I think putting it in the one voice helps because there's only really one voice in the story. As much as there's other voices influencing that one voice, she's the voice.
She does pop in with like narration. The adult voice that you hear doing the narration eventually becomes the voice of Marjan towards the end when she's grown up to be around that age anyway. There is this sort of subtle element of the story catching up to where she was at the beginning, which is even more clear at the end when you kind of see her, I think, getting a cab from the exact same airport.
From the exact same airport, and then, he's asking about her heritage, and she's talking out a lot more openly. She wasn't as open at the university point. Not that she forgot herself necessarily, but she kind of almost at points would act like she'd forgotten where she came from. So that final taxi ride, I'm from Iran, and she's very much remembering that from her family, while she's also riding away from it. She's carrying the good pieces with her, that jasmine, but she's very much symbolically going away, which captures the essence of that development arc.
It was tonally well balanced, I felt. It is quite dark, but it's also quite funny. And I think that's an important thing to get right, especially in animation as well. To kind of find the balance between stuff that's humorous and kind of outlandish, but also stuff that's really dark and sad. Especially in the first half, there's quite a lot of focus on a lot of like horrific stuff that happens because of what the Iran government is doing, in terms of taking people prisoner, the war that's going on, people dying, Marjan seeing a dead person in rubble, even stuff that happens later on, her like becoming homeless for a short period and nearly dying, her being suicidal. All of this stuff is really, really dark and heavy. But what I think the film does well is that it avoids making it too heavy. And there's even like some darkness to it as well, like or a combination between like the darkness and the humor. In that early bit, that is fairly important as a lesson for her to learn, where she's thinking about literally torturing another kid. And that is funny, but in a really, really dark way.
It's almost dressed up as a children's game. But because there's a bunch of kids going, yeah, let's just do this is fine. And then when you actually think about it, it's so dark.
I agree, yeah.
World that they live in that they're like, yeah, this is acceptable, I guess. I think that blend of comedy and real darkness actually helped get some of the experience of living in that time, because obviously they're trying to keep themselves entertained is the wrong word, but you get what I'm driving at. At a time where everything's going to absolute crap. They're trying to have a normal family life while the adults are all acknowledging out loud, this is bad. This is really bad, and trying to cling to whatever bit of hope that they can, while kind of trying to keep it as light as possible, partially for Margie's sake, but partially also for their own sake. It's shown in the way that the relationships are so calm and easy, and they resemble normal relationships in the way they're constructed. So you've got the uncle who's like, oh, I'll tell you everything as a bedtime story. I'll put you to bed, make sure they still had friends over and family doing things and kids running around, that kind of thing. But everything was just so ingratiated in social politics that it just made it really dark and uncomfortable at the same time. I think that's part of the reason the film has stayed with me a bit.
It's animated, but it basically is about reality of a life. And it's interesting to think about this movie in comparison to other films that attempt to specifically capture a life, whether it be a standard biopic or whether it be a fictional one. It's interesting to see how this movie stacks up against other examples that are trying to deal with a person's life over the course of a few decades or something, or over the course of like 2 decades, as this one portrays. Like, it is just 90 minutes, and within that time, there is quite a lot of stuff that they cover. It is a little bit compressed. What I think works about it is that each event has impact. We only see the uncle for like maybe 5 minutes at the most, but him being in prison and then dying is still really, really sad, because in that brief little moment, you get a sense of who he is, what his past is, what his relationship with Marjan is like. You know about the conflict, and then you get the consequence. He gets taken to prison and executed.
His character ultimately achieves 3 things. It gives us that glimpse into the family life of Marjan, which kind of immediately connects you to the family just as much as you'd already been connected, but it connects you even further. Puts you in that space to really see how messed up the whole situation is. Also gets you used to the idea that characters in the film might not stick around for all that long. Nima at the party as a character who, falls to her death and dies running away from the police. You still get those couple of minutes with her where she gets to know Marjan and they've got that. It's not so much a connection, but they're at least in the same place and running from the same force. Sorry, his death. I meant his death. Seeing Nima's death is quite impactful.
And the same goes for like the other people who come in and out of her life. I'm thinking mainly when she goes over to like Germany and she meets colourful people, including a couple of potential love interests. And the point is that you kind of see how that affects her, brings out aspects of her personality, or how it pushes her away, like the boyfriend that was cheating. One of my favourite sequences was actually that bit, the very quick montage you see of her and her boyfriend in love, and then she discovers him cheating, and then you get a whole bunch of flashbacks where she's just narrating it and saying, no, in reality, he was terrible, and listing off all the reasons as to why. The really exaggerated animation that makes him look to be really, really disgusting. All of the flaws that are now like highlighted. I've really seen that done in movies before.
So accurate to the perspective, though. Those subjective moments in the film are really, really great because they give us, it's almost like a psychological authenticity that a lot of films can't achieve because they can't go into that subjective place. I think after a suicide attempt, when she's literally got God on one side and the ideals of communism on the other, all in like one floating cloud ocean thing.
Yeah, basically God and Karl Marx.
Those are the 2 figures in her life that she's been influenced the most by, studied the hardest, and have ultimately also caused her the most problems in terms of her life because she's been around their ideas. The hold that they have over her and the way that they're both simultaneously represented by the sky and the ocean. So like, the very heights that you can hit and the very lowest depths you can get to. I found that really, really effective.
God beforehand is shown to be the quasi-mental figure. From what we can tell, it's probably just a fantasy or like a dream.
I feel like it was an externalized way of getting her inner thoughts out. I feel like they're more her thoughts around it afterwards as opposed to anything real that she'd imagined or thought of, giving us that visual expression to follow. I mean, it just works better in animation anyway. Having it done in that way instead creates the emotion through the visual metaphor and the symbolism that it uses, and the animated character then interacts and the voice work happens. once you've got the accompanying factors, just elevates it to something a little bit more transcendent. I found that really engaging.
Whole like conflict in regards to being a woman in that time as well. How like all of the women eventually are forced to wear the hijab, their headscarves. How Marjan doesn't like that. The mother also clearly doesn't like that, but has to just put up with it. And it also gives focus to all of this stuff that was going on, resulted in affecting the traditional family structure and unit as well, because of the fact that Marjan has to leave the country and then come back and then leave again, more of a personal thing. But even then, all of that stuff was influenced partially by all of this bad political stuff that was going on, all of this like repression that was going on by the Iranian government. It is a pretty critical and damning study of what the Iranian government was like at that time, from the perspective of an actual like Iranian who experienced it. That was like fairly important because of the time it came out. It came out in like the 2000s.
It was very relevant because there was obviously the war going on at the time. It almost helped you think about the way that it pushed the factors that led to the political situation in the first place that then led to the Iranian war.
It depicts it in a very, very like real humanizing light, and it even manages to do it without necessarily showing anything that violent or graphic or anything like that. Content-wise, the film isn't necessarily violent, but it is quite intense and harrowing at points, because it is fairly unflinching in depicting a lot of this stuff, like the emotions of the characters as well. It's not quite cartoon exaggerated, it's more genuine and real when these characters experience hardship and are angry and sad, about where they are and what's going on. That does make the animation style of this movie a bit different to other animated films that go more deliberately for the exaggeration in the characters.
It's very subdued. They're quite simple movements. It's not complicated as such, and it doesn't have characters striking poses. It doesn't really have a lot of different motion lines and things like that. It just shows the characters in their simple states going through things, and it relies a lot more on the juxtaposition of images and the cut itself as opposed to the actual animated motion.
It's not like distinctively fast or slow or anything like that. It just looks completely normal. There is quite a bit of style that especially comes out in like the montages with what they do to kind of visually present the stuff that they're talking about or presenting. All it's stylistic but not exaggerated.
It's got very clear visual identity. It doesn't then take that identity, and it doesn't try to be anything else. It kind of just goes, yeah, this is the way that it works. Also, without trying to be too stylistic. It's not trying to be stylistic. It just is the way the story is. As I said earlier, I think that really adds to the perspective of Marjan. It really pushes that this is her story, her perspective, her mind, and we're along for the ride in it. It does lead you to have that. It at once involves and removes you.
I thought it was a very well-paced movie. Moved along very nicely. I see the first act as being quite long, and kind of ending when she goes away from Iran for the first time. I see it as a three-act structure in that way. And in that sense, you could say that maybe the first act is a lot longer than the second and third acts.
I wouldn't put the film in a three-act structure, actually, though. It fits much more neatly into five. But I'm not counting the airport bit as part of an act. It starts at the 1979 revolution when Anoush comes back, and it ends once the Islamic law is imposed, because that's, if you like, that's your inciting incident that changes things. I think the second act is the life under the new regime. The uncle dies, they're trying to get out, and you start to see the issues with the Islamic takeover in full force and the way that it works there. Act 3 is when she's growing up and in that rebellious stage. Goes from there right up until she goes to encountering more social issues. She's encountering more government pushback, and she's starting to push back herself, and that continues up until she has to leave Iran because it gets too hot for her. University, that's the fourth act. That she goes back to Iran to get married. The fifth act is once she's there and everything comes together and she's like, no, I've gone past that as a person, I've grown that as a person, I don't want to be here, I don't want to be married like this is not the society for me. It goes back out. All the first act then is set up. Then you've got pressure 1, pressure 2, pressure 3, climax. Of those parts of the film are very, very distinct from each other. So I don't see the point of separating it into 3 acts. They're almost like 5 episodic acts that have a through line.
I'm guessing that adds to this movie being more of the capturing of a life on film rather than just a story of a life.
It's still the story of a life, because a 5-act structure isn't that uncommon. I mean, every Shakespeare story is a 5-act structure. Ultimately, every story ever told will always fall within a structure, because you have to structure a story to even be able to tell it. It doesn't feel so much like a film as it does an experience. To deal with something this complicated in traditional film structure, with all its complicated emotion, I just don't think it would work trying to do it as an arc, because it's not really an arc. I mean, there is one, sure. It's not like it doesn't exist, but it's not clear. It doesn't go linearly because the three-act structure is actually quite linear. Even if you take it out of order, the arc itself is linear.
To move away from that, for the most part, it has sympathetic characters as well. I mean, in some ways, it's obviously hard not to sympathize with most of the people in the film, particularly the family, because they're dealing with very hard issues. I did find it to be a very human portrayal of the mother, the father, the uncle, and Marjan as well. I didn't think that they were stereotyped. We really get a sense of the mother, all of the stuff that she has to do with her raising Marjan, but also, again, having to deal with the misogyny of that society. In some ways, the grandma is the one who probably has the biggest influence on Marjan, especially when she actually grows up to be an adult as well. The scene that sticks out to me is the bit where the grandmother yells at her for getting a guy arrested, because it's an important lesson that she has to learn about being a respectable person and not just doing that.
It's uncomfortable to see it happen, but it's also very worthwhile, and I think it's an impactful moment that lets Marjan be really, really flawed, crucially. Again, it helps us understand the environment and the situations and all of that, but it helps drive forward the perspective and emotional complications of the society she lives in.
The relationships in the film were very believable and easy to understand. Really, my only flaw is just that her parents do kind of drop out of it. They're mainly present in the bit where she's a child growing up in Iran, and then when she goes away, and then even when she comes back, they only appear intermittently. And it is mainly only the grandmother that gets quite a few scenes.
I suppose there was some estrangement between the two of them, so it does make sense they don't show up. I agree, it would have been interesting to see how they developed in the time where she was away, but properly see it rather than the flashes that we get. I mean, ultimately, it's not essential to the story that they wanted to tell, so I get why it's not there.
Yeah, and she's an adult now anyway, so she doesn't need her parents as much.
I can see that it would have resolved the parents' stories a little bit. I think because it's ultimately not their stories, it's not enough of a flaw to take too much away from the film.
No, it's not. Ultimately, I think the film's main lesson is about keeping your past present in your mind, remembering where you came from, being a good person, not letting the experiences of your past not actually get you down in the long run.
Communicates the horror of the situation. It communicates the horrific effects that it has. I think it doesn't treat the situation childishly through the eyes of a child, which is quite impressive. Manages to be extremely affecting and well put together.
Would that be your conclusion?
Yeah.
I enjoyed it quite a bit. I think it's quite a good translation of the original comic book series. It's definitely completely visually faithful. Taking that art style and putting it in the animation makes it even more effective. And what it did was showed what you can do with animation, but also the kinds of truthful adult stories that you can tell with that medium. If that attracts you to it, then you should watch it. And otherwise, it's honestly just a fairly good history lesson on Iran at that time, as well as just a good coming of age story. It's a good biopic too. So next week, going to be a single episode this time, focusing on a film that Jack brought up in a previous episode and that I'm getting around to watching finally, The Long Good Friday. See ya.